Welcome everyone to our third session in our People Development Series. In the first two webinars in this series, we talked about shifting our focus to a growth mindset from managing. And we considered how to walk the garden to help facilitate the growth of your employees. Then we considered the role of pruning, of applying a growth facilitation mindset to help shape talent by pruning out the things that distract them from what's really important to them, their growth in the organization. Today, we want to continue on that path and talk about ways to apply these principles to support employee development, the broad population of employees. For those of you who don't know us, let's introduce ourselves. Wes is one of our humaculturists, and he helped develop our humaculture philosophy and approach, and he has years of business experience as well as horticulture experience as an organic gardener, with reaping plentiful garden produce through his organic principles.
And Steve played golf in college at the University of Illinois and finds the golf course to be an excellent place to get to know people. Steve brings over 3 decades of experience as an actuary, and he is our behavioral design expert.
Great. And Christi, I have come to learn, is a world traveler. She just returned from Egypt, where she poked around in the tombs among the pharaohs for a while. And she tells me she's a recovering registered nurse. She has more than 30 years of experience in people and leadership development and related human resources work.
Great. Thank you very much for being here. And we're going to jump right in because we know your time is valuable. So thank you for joining us.
So Wes, which dimensions of humaculture apply to today's discussion?
Well, Steve, you know, as we do in each of these webinars, we first point out that each dimension has a profound impact and an active impact on all of the others. And in fact, that's the idea behind humaculture. When we consider these dimensions, we have a better way to understand the organization, but also a better way to make business decisions in a more effective and holistic way. Today, we're going to talk about employee development, and that means that we want to think about the design of the organization. We want to think about how we select the right people, maximize the value of the intangible assets through an aligned and healthy culture, and design an effective rewards program that will encourage and support fruitful efforts, and finally consider how we transition people when appropriate.
So how are we going to apply this?
So in the first 2 sessions that we've presented, Wes, you talked about walking the garden and pruning to encourage people's growth and adaptation in an organization. So how do you see today's topic of employee development fitting into that growth facilitation mindset for us?
Okay, well, I think the most successful gardeners take a very deliberate approach to gardening. They first have a vision for what they want their garden to be and to do and to produce. They consider the climate and how that's going to affect their efforts. When they know what they want to grow and what they want to produce and how they want to accomplish it, they begin to build the best soil. Soil structure and fertility is very important. Then they select the appropriate plants, but often not just the plants, but the specific variety of plants that will do the best in their particular circumstances. They work to optimally arrange those plants, to cultivate, spend time, and then they spend time walking in that garden as it grows to know when to make adjustments. And that's the essence of this growth mindset that we're wanting to convey. And it's the same really with leaders of an organization. When we think about how to have the most successful organization, we really need to think about what is specifically the organization to do and to accomplish? What's its vision and mission? We need to then lead the organization to clearly communicate that vision and mission in really every aspect of recruiting, hiring, training, and developing employees, and ultimately managers and leaders. But all the while we're doing that, we really need to be providing the right support and rewards. And when we do that, we're really operating in a growth facilitation mindset, and that will always lead us to the most successful organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice analogy to kick us off here. So as we today want to focus on employee development, how we train, support, transition employees. Let's start by considering some ways that employees are impeded in an organization to develop. We're going to talk about warm body syndrome trap. We're going to talk about unhealthy and misaligned cultures and how those disrupt employee development efforts. And then ultimately talk about how is it that career planning often tends to only occur for a select few. And then we will hopefully focus on tying this up at the end with some effective employee development in our organizations today. So,
sounds great, Christi. So let's start with the warm body syndrome trap. How does the warm body syndrome trap become a trap for many employers?
Yeah, so you know what? Look, recruiting and hiring is difficult for everybody right now. I think that everybody on this call should now be laughing out loud because that's the understatement of the year, right? But now we have this quiet quitting, we have the great resignation. These phrases are all the rage now. But the honest truth is, they've been around for a long time. We just didn't have a fancy name for them, right? It's the same thing with warm body syndrome. I've been using this term since 2002 when I started recruiting. And basically what we're trying to figure out is what does it actually mean? And why do employees and organizations specifically settle to hire employees who are just filling a job, right? They're not remotely qualified. So we just hire because we're desperate, right? We just hire anybody we can, and then we sit them in that seat. They're not qualified to do the job. We don't give them enough resources and tools to do their job, and they start to make mistakes, right? They have minimal performance, and those mistakes turn into customer loss because those employees don't know how to support the customers they're serving. And as a result, ultimately, they're not engaged, they're not productive, everybody around them gets to be upset and angry. And the bottom line is, those customers decide to vote with their feet and they go someplace else, right? Now, not only do you have lost productivity, you've got lost revenue in an organization.
That's a great point. And in addition to the customers walking somewhere else, you also wind up with talent you've invested a lot of resources in, and they wind up walking somewhere else as well. So based on the illustration in this, though, Wes, I bet you have some kind of a humaculture analogy that you could share with us.
Actually, I do. So when you look at these two tomatoes, it's probably clear to everyone that they are tomatoes. But one is a large slicing tomato and the other is a cherry tomato. And if you think about a gardener and they want to grow great slicing tomatoes for the 4th of July picnic, and they want those big old beefsteak tomatoes to be, one slice covers the entire hamburger, but they go to the garden center and the garden center doesn't have that particular variety, but they know they want tomatoes, so they buy what they've got, and it turns out that they're cherry tomatoes. And when they serve them at the picnic, people are a little disappointed that they're slicing these little 1-inch diameter tomatoes and having to put them all over their hamburger, in little bitty slices. So when you think about that and the disappointment that comes, it's a pretty good illustration, I think, for the idea that you need the right plant, but you also need the right variety of plants, specific skill sets, et cetera. And if you don't, you're going to end up with this problem that Christi was describing. And I guess I would call this warm plant syndrome if we're going to apply the horticultural version of it.
Which I think these two analogies really work well together, right? Because the best employee development efforts, they're unlikely to overcome these deficiencies that a workforce creates when you start hiring anybody in this warm body trap, right? So even if an employee is ideally suited for this position, if you don't continue to advise their growth and development, that's going to hinder their continued opportunities for improvement. So, Steve, talk a little bit about the unhealthy and the misaligned cultures coming out of this warm body syndrome trap.
Certainly, and in addition to getting the right person, you need the right healthy and aligned culture to ensure that people aren't held back. If you have an unhealthy or an unaligned culture, people aren't going to be able to succeed the way you want them to. People in business think of culture oftentimes, mostly in terms of cultural health, which is like toxic employees, poor trust in leadership, et cetera. And an unhealthy culture certainly limits employees' development efforts, but it can actually cause deterioration of mental and physical health of the employees as well. But even the healthiest of cultures cannot overcome the confusion of an unaligned culture. And if your training and development aren't geared towards the intentional culture, you're also going to fail. For example, let's take one dimension of an aligned culture, which is your customer orientation. Is if your organization is oriented, is much more of a transactional business, and you're training people to be customer intimate, you're probably not going to generate the success that you want. So you really need to think about the nature of your organization and how to develop people best for your type of organization.
Right. Yeah, and I think you can see on the slide here that we've in each of the quadrants, as we think about what's an unhealthy culture and what's a healthy culture from an alignment or a misalignment perspective, you can see that we've chosen some TV shows as some analogies here, right? So Wes tossed out the A-Team. I decided that might be a little bit of a too far in the past opportunity here. So I went with something a little more updated. I think everyone on this call is likely familiar with The Office. If you've never watched it, I'm sure you understand the concepts. You might actually work in an office like The Office, but that's sort of the epitome of what not to do, right? Even though it's hilariously Steve Carell and perfect. The Sopranos, they show you how to be a family, but they're a little not on the same healthy stage as perhaps we would like an office to be. So, I think there's probably plenty of other shows out there as an example, but we thought these kind of hit the mark when we think about what are unhealthy or healthy and aligned cultures.
Well, that's great. So, so Steve talked about though the alignment quite a bit. Christi, what is a way, for instance, or some ways that an employer or organization might find itself building an unhealthy culture?
If they're not aligned with the vision, the mission, and the values of their organization. I think that's the most important piece, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But overall, if an employee does not understand why they're there, it's going to be really hard for them to be successful and really hard for them to actually show a customer they want to be there, they're engaged, they're productive, and not only make money for the organization, but make a customer that comes in feel good about themselves.
That's good.
Yeah, but some organizations don't seem to do a good job of employee development because there's very little thought about how the career paths and how do you grow them personally and professionally in the organization.
Right, and as you mentioned in our last session, actually this kind of ties us together with performance management and what is the traditional employee development path, because it also often focuses on how they're weak, right? We point out their weaknesses, we point out what they're doing wrong, instead of actually helping them to grow and develop. What are you doing well? And here's an opportunity that I would see so that you can progress within this position and potentially grow into a larger position, which increases engagement, increases that desire to be productive for an organization, right? Increases their ability to want to stay with an organization, so it decreases that turnover, and it makes the organization far more competitive in the market when those employees want to be there and they want others to join them.
So Christi, that's great. And when I think about that earlier example of the tomatoes, one solution would be the gardener could say, well, I'm going to buy the seeds and start from the beginning. And they could plant the seeds in the little pots that you normally see, like the little 6-pack pots if you go to the nursery, that sort of thing. But they need a plan. A gardener that's going to be successful needs a plan to know, well, when am I going to transplant those seeds, for instance, into maybe a secondary pot to let the plant get a little more established. But then what's the plan for getting them into the garden? How much space do they need? what kind of supports am I going to provide them? How, what kind of irrigation am I going to use, and those sorts of things. So even if you're selecting the very best varieties, you still need that plan for those transitions and growth and moving them through the process. If I don't do that before I get started, I'm still going to fail.
That's a great analogy. So in organizations that do not give sufficient attention to career plannings or opportunities for people who want to see their future in the organization and their path to get there, they'll probably become frustrated and begin seeking opportunities elsewhere.
Yeah, and so that is why this focus for organizations on growth facilitation is so important, right? You need to make sure that you have the right soil in your organization. You want to make sure you choose the right plant or employee for your organization. Make sure that it's fertilized. You're encouraging that employee, right? And ultimately, if they want to transition from one position to another, that you give them the opportunity to do that with the right support. And in those cases, you're going to make sure you got the right person in the right seat, and they're going to be productive, engaged, and make money for your organization, which is the overall goal.
Yeah, it's exactly spot on, Christi. That in fact is the point of this whole series, that getting us to shift our thinking, get the growth facilitation mindset squarely in the way that we operate and everything that we're doing.
Right. I'd say many organizations, if not most, spend a lot of time and energy managing employees and trying to manage performance. And we can all fall into this trap of focusing on checklists of competencies, getting the annual performance appraisal process completed and the paperwork filed, that dreaded annual process that no one likes and really detracts from the whole employment experience. So again, our goal with this webinar series is to change our thinking, to change our mindset from one of managing problems to one of growth facilitation.
Right. So let's start to think about what do we do? How do we do that, right? How do we make employees, how do we hire the right employees, and how do we keep the right employees as well? And so you can see here, on this slide, the 4 ways that we want to be intentional, right? This is about intentionality. Be specific, and this is easier said than done. I get that. But if we start to think about creating and building the right framework for hiring the right candidates, that means not only are we getting them in the door, we're going to then support them on the other end to give them the tools and resources that they have to do their job. A few slides ago, I mentioned you want to make sure that that vision and mission is clear as they enter that organization. Make sure that the people in the organization already understand why they're there. What are we working towards? When we think about alignment of jobs and positions, making sure that those job descriptions clearly articulate what's our job here in the organization and how does that support the mission from a strategic perspective, right? And that becomes your soil structure, clarifying the vision and the mission, and then alignment of the positions. It's planting and rooting that person in that soil, right? And now cultural health and alignment becomes easier because you want to make sure that you've targeted those people in the door, you're giving them the resources for them to be successful. Again, then support those people for growth and development. Train for skill. We've all heard hire for fit, train for skill. It's easier said than done. I totally get that. But let's make sure that we're forming at least the basis of and a foundation of what's our hiring practice to get them in the door and then support them on their way.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And in fact, we're one of the clients that we've been supporting is we're working through a collective bargaining process, but the job descriptions are very, very much off target. And some of them are listed as management type jobs, but they're really not. They're more a lead position. And so they're not really following through with what the job is supposed to be. And so the people that they're attracting and interest are finding that the job is not what they really expected and the pay is not what they really expected. So they're having a difficult time with recruiting. So getting this right is very, very important for many reasons. So let's also then think about this in terms of one of the prior topics, and we've alluded to it here, but the idea of that effective pruning is going to bear more fruit. And how does that fit into what we're talking about now?
Yeah, so I think your collective bargaining, the project they're working on, I think is a good example, because one of the things that we did with them was we started with what do they want from a customer experience, and then what do you need from an employment experience to deliver on that. So I think that feeds in nicely to this. Is so what is it that we need? We need to have the right hires, and that vision for the customer and employment experience is important. And then we need to be sure that we have the appropriate training and development to guide people to that employment experience and the customer experience. And then we need to support them once they're in place, which is like your trellising and irrigation, to assure that employees can thrive and reach their full potential in the organization. Does that make sense, Wes?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think we've talked about this before, but a lot of people think about pruning as simply, hacking away at the plant in some way that, maybe it's overgrowing the sidewalk and you just cut it back. And I guess that's a type of pruning for sure, but the real point here is that if we're pruning for production or for growth, what we're doing is we're selecting those aspects of the plant that are going to be the most fulfilling for both it and the organization that it's growing in. And when we do that, what we're really doing is we're removing distractions, and we're really encouraging that plant to put the energy of growth into the areas that are going to be the most beneficial for it, and again, what we're trying to accomplish. So pruning really should be an effort of directing energy based on the plant's natural desire and abilities to produce whatever it is it's supposed to produce. And the same is true for employees, really. And they'll be more fulfilled when they do that. But not only do we need to prune, we need to think about that support. And, you could, using our tomato example, let's follow through with that. You can grow tomatoes in the garden, but if you don't support them, they're likely to be, especially the vining types, laying on the ground, and the fruit may waste, or it may not be as good a quality. So we really get the best quality production when we provide the kind of support that those tomatoes need. And again, the same is true for our employees. We want to really give them what they need to succeed. As Christi mentioned earlier, the right tools and the right resources to do the job we're asking them to do. But we also need to provide the right conditions. Most plants are going to take nutrients from the soil when conditions are optimal. And so when we think about irrigation, that's one of the main issues. Some plants like very wet soils. Some plants like more dry soils. We need to make sure we're doing things in the right way to optimize that nutrient absorption. And that's really true of how we design our rewards programs. When we design reward programs in the right way, we're incentivizing and encouraging the right choices and behaviors among the employees.
Yeah, that's right. And I think for each of those rewards, we need to really pay attention to the behavioral design of each, because when you design them properly, you're going to get the right absorption of those nutrients or those rewards to make sure they're optimized for the organization. So one of the things that it strikes me is that all of this is really talking about your employees that you're growing within the organization. It seems like this doesn't necessarily yet address the wrong people in a position. This is only for the right employees that are most likely to succeed at your organization. So organizations really need to think about, well, what do you have in place to help employees understand where their greatest contribution may lie? And how do you help employees know what to do and want to do it? The wrong people may need to be transitioned or transplanted somewhere else in the organization or pruned out completely.
Yeah, that's right. So let's go ahead and talk about the function of how we move employees around an organization and how we can transition them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about transplanting, quote unquote, transplanting employees, that's exactly right. We're talking about transitions. So, again, remember the tomato example. What we're saying is that we need to have a plan to move that plant through the various life stages of the organization, through the organization, in order for it to be truly effective. And the same thing is true about employee development. We need to make sure all employees have good career path options, I think.
Yeah, and you know what, ultimately, I think so many of us just see this straight upward motion and mobility for employees in an organization, but we aren't necessarily thinking about lateral mobility. So how are we encouraging our employees to be curious, lean in, you know, branch out into other areas of the organization that they might have an interest in? And our job as leaders is to encourage that, right? How do we help someone, it's a driver, a delivery driver, who might want to stop driving and come inside and be customer focused at the front counter of an organization? That's some lateral mobility, and maybe they want to do that ultimately to have an upward mobility as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm not a big sports fan, but Steve encouraged me to watch the movie Moneyball some time ago, and as I did, I really liked it. It had a lot of aspects that are very much like the Humaculture principles we're sharing now. And you know, one of those is, well, we don't need to necessarily spend all that money on the star player. What we really need to do is make sure that we're allocating our resources in the right way to get the players in place that are, you know, we're buying runs or wins or runs batted in or whatever it might be. And we need to think of our organizations that way. When we think about we've got to just pay the most money for the star player, we're really falling into the feeding the plant trap, and we're not feeding the soil rather than the plant, which will ultimately allow the plant to grow. And so that also means that as you think about it like that, there were a lot of times when players were traded and moved around because they needed to be transitioned into the right organization where they could do the right things and do them well.
Right. I think there's all different types of forms of transition. And when a plant is no longer productive, the seeds need to dry up and fall to transition to the next step. So some examples of different types of transitions is another role within the organization, another job with another organization, another role outside the workforce, perhaps a board role to build their leadership their leadership skills, perhaps a volunteer position to help support the community mission, parenting to make sure that they'll be successful in that role, and also retirement. I think the transition to retirement is a particularly important transition, and effective employee development needs to include leading employees to be prepared for this transition as well, regardless of whatever career path they've chosen, to ensure that knowledge gets transferred appropriately, as well as that they're prepared financially and socially for that next stage in their life.
Yeah, we only have a minute or so left, but Steve, can you just tell us about these life's little shortcuts here? We all have these and we all make decisions based on these. Tell us how they can be helpful or harmful to us.
That's right. I'll go through these quickly. What we're seeing here is there's 2 green, 2 red. The green are examples of how heuristics or these life little shortcuts could help us achieve our goal, whether it's using a pre-commitment strategy to ensure people follow through, or diversification bias to make sure we're helping as many people as possible so that we'll get the right people to grow as their life changes, as the organization changes. The next 2 are how we might inhibit our growth and our achievement of growth facilitation, which is a confirmation bias. If you're only helping those people that think like you, or a present bias where you're only thinking about what's necessary to get through today or to deliver what needs to be today without thinking about the future.
Yeah, I think we're just about out of time there. So Steve, do you want to just kind of tell us about the next webinar series and where we're going from here? Sure.
So what we've got is our next session. It will be in January. We'll continue to this discussion around the shift to growth facilitation, thinking about it from a manager perspective. How do you get managers to really focus on that transition, to focus on the growth facilitation and cut out the things that might detract from them being successful in that role? So they got to prune away some of the things that they did as in their employee role to now focus on their manager role.
Sounds good.
And we don't have any time for questions, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you find this helpful. We would love to hear from you, to learn more from you about your specific challenges or circumstances. Please remember to register for our January session and complete the survey. We really value your feedback, and we try to work it into each of our subsequent sessions.
Yeah, if you want to send us some questions, we'll be sure to get answers to you in some fashion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.